And we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to History Indoors. Great to see a few of you already in the chat already. I see that George has already said he's looking forward to this talk, so we're so thankful for that. So thank you, George, for your nice comment there. Please do let us know where you're from and where you're listening from, and all these things, because we like to just know where our listeners and those who are watching are from. It makes it fun for us, and it's nice to know the reach that we have. So do let us know in the chat box. I just say welcome to History Indoors. We provide history talks every fortnight on a range of different topics, ranging from, well, we've had talks about the ancient world, all the way going through to the modern periods, covering talks from economic, social histories, all the way through to military histories as well. So we have a wide range of histories and a wide range of stories to think about. So if you do want to kind of do subscribe, do check us out, do like this video, do make sure that reach goes out, do let your friends know about History Indoors. We are, I think, we are getting closer to 2,000 subscribers, so please do subscribe the button, because the more subscribers we get, the more history people can see, and that's good for us, isn't it, as well. Our channel has loads of stuff as well, so please do stay tuned for all the content we have as well. We are on social media, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, all those kind of things as well. But that's enough about History Indoors. I'm really looking forward to this talk. I'm not going to lie, as a Civil War historian, I am really looking forward to this. Actually, our first talk for History Indoors was about the Civil War by myself. So this is actually, I'm so excited for this. And we got a fantastic speaker this evening. I forgot what time it was, in Mark Turnbull. And Mark has actually published some fiction books on the Civil War. He's delving into the non-fiction world as well, and he also runs a podcast as well. So if you want your Civil War stuff, he's the man to go to. That's for certain. So I'm really looking forward to this talk. Mark, thank you so much for wanting to speak and for wanting to delve into the Civil War this evening. I will pass over to you in a moment, if you could share your screen, and then I will disappear, because people aren't here for me; they are here for you and the Civil War. So I will say bye for now, everyone. But I will be in the comments. I should mention very quickly: there's a Q&A afterwards. Do have your questions. Do ask questions throughout the talk. We'll make note of them, and we'll answer them at the end. I'm looking for that Q&A especially. So, without further ado, I'll say bye and look forward to this talk.
Okay, thanks, Michael. And welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining the talk, as Michael had mentioned. And again, thanks for the History Indoors team for hosting it as well, and for letting me talk about the Civil War, which is a rarity because my friends and family are not particularly interested in it. So I'll start just by briefly just building on what Michael had said there. So I'm Mark Turnbull. I've been obsessed with the 17th century and the Wars of the Three Kingdoms since I first came across the period at the age of 10 after a visit to Helmsley Castle in Yorkshire. Since then, I've reenacted the period as a pikeman, and as we mentioned, written about the history. And the latest book that I've written is a biography of Charles I, and that's Charles I's private life. So I'm just going to start the slideshow. So flags and formalities, the start of the Civil War. That isn't a genuine Van Dyke, by the way. That's a creation after the visit to Helmsley Castle. Okay. So tonight I'm going to talk about the start of the English Civil War, or the English aspect of the War of the Three Kingdoms, and the devastating civil wars of the 17th century tore Great Britain's three kingdoms apart. They were wars without an enemy. But there's disagreement to this day over the point that civil war formally began in England, involving Charles I and his Parliament. So I'm going to explore some of the most popular flashpoints in more detail, before focusing on another, which I came across during research for the biography. And this other event offers fascinating context and unbelievably receives scant mention in history books. And I have to say that I'm really grateful to Professor Jonathan Healy, who responded to my blog post about this and contributed some extra detail. So when the official start of the English Civil War is mentioned, most people agree on it being the raising of the King's Royal Standard in Nottingham, the 22nd of August, 1642. It's logical, it formalised matters, and it's in almost all of the history books. There's also an iconic status to that event even today, and it's even marked still in Nottingham as Nottingham Day. But it's not the only date that's in the mix for that formal start. So a few months back, on the anniversary of the standard, I asked on social media, what do people associate as the formal date when war began? And the three main dates or occasions were proposed. And number one there is the 5th of March 1642, which is Parliament passing the Militia Ordinance, and 8% of people opted for that date. Now, this was Parliament deciding that they alone could appoint officers of the militia across England, and in effect taking control of the armed forces. And that was a royal prerogative power that was taken away from the monarch. And that was despite the king refusing to give royal assent to the militia bill. By God, not for an hour, he'd replied, seeing it as part of his coronation oath to uphold. So many see that as the defining breach between the two. Number two is the king being refused entry to Hull on the 23rd of April 1642, and 18% of respondents went for that one. So a bit of context with that. So within the walls of Hull was a stash of 7,000 barrels of gunpowder, 120 pieces of ordnance, and arms for 20,000 men. And that's really what made Hull a key fortress to control for both sides. There was also the king's 9-year-old son, the Duke of York, and his nephew, the Elector Palatine, who'd been sent to visit the day before, the 22nd. When the king himself came before the town with a couple of hundred followers, there was an epic showdown. So the gates were closed, drawbridges were raised, and Parliament's governor of the town, John Hotham, stood on the walls and refused his royal visitor entry, even when trumpets pronounced him a traitor. Now, checkmated, so the king had no alternative but to withdraw. And that rebuttal before Hull was an intensely embarrassing episode. And looking at contemporaries about Hull, so in his memoirs, a man called Sir Richard Bulstrode declared his opinion that rebuttal at Hull was the point when war had been, quote, openly declared against the king. Now, in more recent times, there's a plaque near the site of where that principal entrance to Hull was, and that commemorates what occurred there as the first overt act of the Civil War. So Hotham's actions did seem to fly in the face of Parliament's assertion that it was opposing the king's evil counsellors and not his royal person. And the third one, the raising of the royal standard in Nottingham. So historic royal palaces, UK Parliament archives, British Library, almost every history book agrees on that, as do 66% of people that responded. But, we know that both King and Parliament were raising troops, securing strongholds, munitions. They were battling it out in skirmishes, civilian street fights, well before the 22nd of August. But because of that ceremonial flag event, responsibility for officially kicking off the hostilities is often laid squarely at Charles's door. Now, that can sometimes skew perceptions of the beginnings of the conflict as well as of the king himself. So just to give you a bit of the overview there. So there were 170 votes on this particular one. A couple of other people were opted for other, and they were mainly, that was 7%, and people were sort of saying things like events in Scotland. But really, the question was looking at the English Civil War as part of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. So you might think that sounds quite clear-cut. So the majority of authorities and history books go for the 22nd of August. I was just checking to see if there's any burning questions there. I can see where there's people from all across the country there. Okay, so what was the raising of the standard? So, it's a defining moment, but what actually was it? Well, this was a ceremony where Charles was declaring his leading enemies to be rebels. His manifesto was read, and in it, he declared his intention to suppress the rebellion of the Earl of Essex, who was Parliament's Lord General. And he called for the aid and assistance of all of his loving subjects to do that. So it was a method of declaring war on those in armed rebellion, but it also delegitimized anybody who was in arms opposing the monarch. In the ceremony, the portrait you see there is Sir Edmund Verney. He declared that he would never part with the standard unless his soul was wrested from his body, which is eventually what happened. The standard itself was hoisted not just once but twice. First time it was stuck in a badly dug hole, only to be blown down, which was considered a very bad omen. And in the days following the raising of the standard, it really seemed like the royal advisors were prepared to undermine the ceremony altogether, no matter Verney's vow. So much to the king's frustration, a majority of people persuaded him to send envoys to London in a last-ditch attempt to secure peace. Now that was a move that really discouraged royalist supporters from coming out in support of the king, because they had a really strong fear that the king, if they declared their colours, the king would sell out to his enemies, and he had done that in the past. So for Charles, with scarcely 1,000 troops by his side, he'd hoped that ancient ceremony would bring in patriotic recruits to his cause. But in the aftermath, it was around a meagre 30 that appeared. Now, as Parliament's army then, after that, 15,000 drew closer, Charles was forced to flee west towards the Welsh border. So perhaps the best thing would be to just put those three major events into a bit of a timeline. And I know that looks quite a busy slide, but if we just go through, oops, sorry, just go back. So we got the 4th of January 1642, the very start of the year. This is when the king lost London, and he attempted to arrest 6 members of Parliament, his leading opponents. We've got the 5th of March, which we'd mentioned, the militia ordinance that Parliament passed. We've got the refusal at Hull. Throughout May and June, we have both sides attempting to recruit soldiers by their own means and secure arms. 5th of July, we've got what is often given as the first casualty of the English Civil War, and that was a weaver in Manchester in a street fight. Then we've got the siege of Hull, the 10th to the 27th of July. The king laid siege to Hull, which failed. We've got the 13th of July. The Earl of Essex is commissioned by Parliament. And then we've got some other events, which I'll come to in a little bit. And that's the 2nd of August, 1642, which is the governor of Portsmouth declaring for the king. And then we've got a skirmish at Marshal's Elm in Somerset on the 4th of August. And although there are previous skirmishes, that's the one that, well, for example, one particular authority, so Professor Gaunt, had mentioned that Marshall Elm, in his opinion, was the bloodiest of all of the skirmishes. And then finally, we've got the raising of the royal standard. So that's a bit of a brief timeline there. Now, as soon as the king did announce an intention. As soon as the king did announce an intention to raise his standard, Parliament declared he hath now at last resolved to set up his royal standard and drawn his sword for the destruction and ruin of his most faithful and obedient people, whom by the laws of the land, the laws of the kingdom, he's bound to preserve and protect. For me, by and large, that's the accepted perception, I think, that's come down to a lot of the history books. The king declared war, and he did that either on his people, some people say, or on Parliament as its entirety. A couple of sort of social media comments on the anniversary of the standard. We have there, in effect, the king had declared war on Parliament and amassed an army. Another one there, the standard ignited the civil war. A declaration of war on Parliament, officially declaring war against Parliament. Because King Charles is a single person and an authority figure, I think his actions are seen as defining, decisive, and standalone. And it's easy to look at this and see him as the sole aggressor who started the war. I think a key factor, though, to consider is that Parliament didn't have the legal authority to declare war. That was within the monarch's prerogative power. So in effect, what we've got is a situation where to formally begin a civil war, the king has to shut up or put up. So shut up and risk being defeated, or put up his standard. So that's what we know. But here's the extra context. So if we go back to the timeline of 1642, so I'd come across a reference of the Venetian ambassador in early August. And that mentioned that Parliament, in these words, had just declared war on the king. And I had never heard of that before. So in terms of what we covered, that really turns everything on its head. And it was so surprising that I just assumed that was incorrect. It was some sort of mistake. Looked into it a little bit further, and that's when I wrote the blog post and put my thoughts out there. And then realised, especially with Jonathan responding, that this genuinely was a declaration that was omitted from almost all history books. And the Venetian ambassador, just to give a bit of context, they are like a worldwide professional neighbourhood watch. They know everything that's going on, and they document that in very detailed letters home. And those letters are for the government of the Republic of Venice's eyes. So they're not, there to curry favour from people in the country where they are stationed. So I looked into what the Venetian ambassador was referring to and found minutes in the House of Lords Journal from the 2nd of August, 1642. So we're talking nearly 3 weeks before the standard. And in those minutes, there was a draft public declaration approved that justified Parliament's reasons for taking up arms against the king's adherents, his evil counsellors, as they saw them. Now, that declaration had already passed the House of Commons, and the Lords made a couple of amendments. And the ambassador refers to that declaration being made public on the 3rd of August. The reason I've got the 4th there is that John Rushworth, who later became Thomas Fairfax's secretary, he documents that declaration as the 4th in his historical collections. So that 4th of August declaration is where MPs and peers announce in a long statement that they were engaged in a quote necessity to take up arms against a malignant party in arms against them. Now, both sides were in arms, basically already, but that declaration formalises things from Parliament's point of view. And also, as Jonathan pointed out, Jonathan Healy, he mentioned that this is also seen as a call to Scotland for assistance as well. Now, the declaration itself makes no bones that MPs and peers think it fit to give this account unto the whole world as to the justice of their proceedings. And what it does is very much like the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. It lists all of the key moments in the slide to war. So it's justifying hostilities against that malignant party that are surrounding the monarch, because Parliament is careful not to accuse the monarch personally. The monarch's been controlled by a malignant party. So it ranged from the king's failed attempts to impose what they call a popish prayer book on Scotland. It lists his attempt against the 6 members of Parliament and the fiasco before Hull. And it concludes by requiring all those that have a sense of piety and honour or compassion to come to our aid and assistance, this being the true cause for which we raise an army under the command of the Earl of Essex, with whom in this quarrel we will live and die. So just as the king formally summoned men to his side when he raised his banner 3 weeks later, by this declaration, Parliament were calling men to Essex's colours. So what happened in the days following the declaration? Well, there was another one. So on the 8th of August, a further parliamentary declaration went further, and that specifically called on their supporters to kill or slay anyone who opposed them. Now, something as strongly worded as this, even the 4th of August one, didn't get a direct response from the king until the day after. So on the 9th of August is when Charles finally responds with an equally decisive public declaration in which he deems Lord Essex and his officers rebels according to the treason statute of Edward III. But he does offer to pardon the common soldiers that in his eyes have been led astray. Now the king, in that declaration, calls for his supporters to resist and subdue the said Earl and his adherents, and to apprehend them or destroy them. And the Venetian ambassador again pops up at this point, and he calls that declaration of the king's a declaration of war. So he's referring now to this declaration in the same way that he referred to Parliament's 5 days earlier. So in effect, you've got both sides there who have now come to a position of formal war. And it's on the 12th of August when Charles finally announces the intention to raise the standard, but he doesn't actually name a date yet. He's actually trying to hold off because of his weak position. So was the standard a reactive move? And how does that change perceptions of that event? Well, if we reconsider the royal standard in light of that context, I think it is clear that Charles is on the back foot, as usual. He was not an astute politician. He showed too much clemency when he should have been ruthless. And also many of his contemporaries, such as the Earl of Clarendon and Richard Bulstrode, actually write that the raising of the standard was reactionary. Clarendon says it was caused by an accident that made it absolutely necessary for the king to declare war early. And Bulstrode also says, he also uses the phrase, he says, by a very unhappy accident, he was obliged to declare war before he was in any condition for action. Now that accident is Colonel George Goring, the governor of Plymouth. So the parliamentarian Goring had agreed to turn court, and he was in secret correspondence with the king and queen. Now that act of Goring's would give the king Portsmouth, which would be a port through which he could receive supplies from the continent. But Goring moved too soon. Charles was absolutely in no readiness for war. He was in no position to secure Portsmouth. And not being in that readiness for war explains why the king didn't formally raise his standard earlier. So he didn't raise it before that explosive 4th of August declaration, and he didn't even raise it in the aftermath, and was quite reluctant to do it on the 22nd. But by the start of August, I think it's becoming increasingly clear when looking at all of the context that formal warfare was practically inevitable, because of the civilian and military clashes on both sides. But I think there was certainly no way back after the start of those declarations with parliaments on the 4th of August. The longer Charles hesitated, the sooner Parliament, who had control of the Royal Navy, a hugely superior army, they'd undoubtedly capture him. And his Sergeant Major General, Jacob Astley, warned as much at Nottingham. He could be seized from his bed. So by raising the standard, that is, in effect, it's a last-ditch attempt to drum up much-needed military support. And the king was then trying to transform his enemies into rebels and justify his own cause. So in my view, the standard should be really seen as a mere formality. The king was formalising what all of those declarations had already formalised, and both sides had unleashed war already. So we move on to the Earl of Clarendon. The 4th of August declaration, it's missing from almost every history book, as we've, as I've already covered. But crucially, it's missing from Clarendon's history of the Great Rebellion. Now, it's a renowned history, and Jonathan Healey thinks that this is a strike and omission if we are to consider the 4th of August as a declaration of war. And that's right, it is a strike and omission. But I would counter about being wary of treating Clarendon as the sole authority. What Clarendon does say in his publications is that at the end of July, Parliament, in his eyes, were intent on making war, whereas the king was incapacitated and couldn't. And he also, pre-4th of August, mentions levying war, beginning war so many times. And the other thing with the term declaring war, in terms of contemporaries, I think it's clear, and we'll come on to a couple of them, they've all got a variety of different dates in their minds as to when they personally think war is officially broken out. So if their view is that war has already broken out before the 4th of August, then I think naturally there'll be a tendency not to make much of that 4th of August declaration as a result, because they believe war's already started. But also, if they share the viewpoint that Parliament doesn't have a legal right to declare war, then that could be another reason why they won't note that 4th of August as a declaration of war. And Clarendon is a lawyer, so for him, clearly he would be aware of that. I wonder if it's telling that it's the Venetian ambassador that does use the phrase of declaring war, perhaps because he's not altogether familiar with the legal position. So let's have a look at some of the contemporary views. So when did King Charles, for example, consider war to have started? So for Jonathan, his sense is that Charles probably considered a state of war, or at the very least a rebellion, to exist from the point of being turned away from Hull. And that's based on John Rushworth's work, which describes Charles having said on May the 4th that Hull was the point when actual war was levied upon us. Personally, I also do think that Charles's reference on the scaffold, when he denied that he'd started the war and said that they began upon me with the militia, could suggest that he saw the militia ordinance, or the 5th of March, as the start. Some other of his contemporaries, well, we've talked about the Venetian ambassador already, who thought formal war had started on the 4th and then the 9th. We've got Bulstrode Whitlock, so a parliamentarian lawyer. He seems to feel that the war had already began in July, and for him it was the raising of forces and the naming of generals. And we've also got Sir Richard Bulstrode, who's a royalist diplomat and soldier. And he is of the opinion that it's the king's refusal entry to Hull when it was openly declared. And lastly, there's Symonds Dews. So he hates the 4th of August Declaration, and he says it's full of virulent expressions against the king. But he only gets to a point where he mentions war on the 10th of August, when he says hot fiery spirits have begun a civil war. So by that point, he considers war to be an actuality, that it was the fault of these fiery spirits, and that suggests that he sees the Somerset skirmish as perhaps the beginning of war. More recently, Conrad Russell, a respected historian on the period, felt that the 4th of August Declaration called for war. So, in conclusion, personally, I think that fascinating context just reveals so much more about that slide to war in England. I do think that the parliamentary declaration of the 4th of August is extremely significant, and it's under-examined, and that's something that Jonathan agrees with. It can't and really shouldn't be omitted any longer from studies of the Civil War and the beginnings. I think regardless of political viewpoints, the 4th of August and the 8th of August declarations are key acts that bring about the formal state of civil war in England. It does put to bed that enduring narrative that Charles unleashed war on his people on the 22nd of August, in effect being the sole aggressor. Because if Parliament had a standard of its own, I think it would have been flapping above the chambers 2 weeks earlier than Nottingham. So both sides declared war on each other. But there could be, just nip back one slide. There could be two ways to look at those declarations. One, as the date when Parliament declared war on the king, or at least formalised hostilities by levying troops, or because Parliament had no legal right to declare war, the formal start would have to remain as the 22nd with the standard. But if so, I think that event by definition is of lesser importance in this context, being reactive and defensive. Charles really, in such a weak position, had no alternative but to host that ceremony early because of his inferior military strength. And there we are at the end. So I hope you found that fascinating detail, as interesting as I have. And I think we just check if there's any questions.
Well, let me just thank you, Mark, for that absolutely fascinating talk. And you got me thinking actually now. So I have to go and do my own thinking, because that is absolutely fascinating to think about. Actually, yeah. What date was it? And I didn't even know those didn't know that those declarations even existed myself. So I think you've certainly convinced me anyway. Let's say that. I think I've been convinced about that. Actually, maybe the date's a bit earlier than actually perhaps what I thought about myself. And almost it feels like, it does feel like that raising the flag is almost just like a sense of a response, a reaction, almost just the formality of it all, just kind of saying now, okay, this is what this situation is, like going through what the legal system was basically of what had already taken place, which is a declaration of war from Parliament. So that is interesting. I am, and just a question. We've got a question already here from Francis, which is, has no one ever looked at these details beforehand? And I've got a question to add to that, is that if maybe people have slightly, maybe, in part, but why haven't they brought it out more? Because they seem like quite big documents to kind of consider.
Yeah, I agree. I think they are huge documents that have just been completely overlooked. And personally, I think part of it is because this is a complex conflict. you get even filmmakers, publishing houses historically have been a little bit reticent about touching it because it can be that complicated. So, I think part of it has something to do with that. It's easier to, it's not saying that the formal start of war can't be the 22nd, but it certainly makes that more hollow, and not the event that we naturally think it is. So perhaps it's because it did fit into that neat box of, well, the king declared war. He began the war on the 22nd. He raised the standard. That's all nice and neat. So, I haven't read a history book actually that mentions it specifically, and that's what really threw me. And that's why I had to really take another look and really sort of go to town and research and sort of put it into the fuller context. But people definitely have seen it, and Conrad Russell, historian, he clearly had seen it and commented on it, and there is contemporary people that have mentioned it, but it's how they, again, and that's the other thing, it's how they view it. So if they don't, in their mind, if it's not a declaration because of a mere formality, that Parliament didn't have that power, I think that's how it can be overlooked, because people think it's another quite a rambling declaration, like the Grand Remonstrance with 200 points. So it takes some sort of going through. So it could be a number of reasons like that.
Yeah, I just another thought that came to my head as well about that. I mean, we've got some other questions coming up, so no one go anywhere. We've got some good questions coming up, but there's also a sense of as well. I think the Civil War became very much a Charles versus Cromwell narrative, especially in the Victorian period, and so how easy is it to just that public image of the war being Charles versus Cromwell? I mean, you look at the film Cromwell, like he's at the start as well, and so this narrative has always been there, isn't it? So it's
Yeah,
very easy for people to go, "Oh, Charles started it," and then Cromwell was like, "No," and then had a massive punch up. That's almost what it feels like sometimes in the public narrative,
yeah,
anyway. And I think that comes, I think, from the Victorians, especially. So that maybe that's also a reason why, as well, is that we do like to see history through individuals, and Parliament is hard to see it as an individual at this point in time.
yeah,
Rather, Charles is, as you said in your talk, that singular figure, that one character who
yeah.
everyone could look to and go, ah, that's the person. So that also something to consider as well. That's
And
just
if you've got a figure there as well, like Charles, who has his flaws,
yeah,
then it is easy to pin, different events on those flaws, isn't it?
yeah, exactly, because they kind of fit into what always been created or whatever's been seen. So you can easily just make it fit almost in that regard. Because he
Yeah,
has his flaws. You can then go, well, this A plus B equals C, and so you
yeah,
get that as well. I mean, I do more questions about that now. The kind of why people haven't mentioned it, but especially the contemporary authors. But we've got questions from the audience, and they're more
yeah.
important than my questions. So we'll go to the audience first. We got a question from Malvern, which so why did Parliament choose the date of the 4th of August, declare they're taking up arms? Did this have anything to do with the siege of Hull by the king? Was this kind of, I guess was it a sequence of events? Basically, I think is the question.
Yeah, yeah, and it definitely was a sequence of events. So from January, you can see that slide happening, with the militia ordinance, which was revolutionary. It was taking that hereditary power away from the king without his consent, and for the king that was a really big thing. Because the armed forces is an extremely powerful tool, to have. So I think there was that build up. The siege of Hull was an escalation, but again, it came about because of a really quite an episode. The king, one of the king's, one of the Queen's friends, to be honest, Lord George Digby, he'd fled to Holland and he came back to join the king at York, and he was captured by the governor, by the Parliamentarian Navy, and brought into Hull.
Yeah.
Oh, have we
Sorry.
gone?
No,
Have
we're
I
still
gone
here.
there? Oh, sorry. Yeah, that my
We're still here.
screen
Don't
just
worry. Don't
vanished.
worry.
Yeah.
That's fine. We're still
Sorry
here.
about
I
that.
was wondering. I was like, oh, he's paused. Do I say
Yeah,
anything?
sorry.
Uh,
It
yeah.
just went blank there. Yeah, so Digby was taken into Hull, and it all came about because Digby pretended to be a Frenchman, and then eventually revealed his identity to the Governor Hotham. And apparently Hotham engaged in some talk about surrendering Hull, but he requested the king come before it with an army, just to satisfy his honour. And that's what the king did. So in the end, he came before Hull, sort of threw up siege works and everything, and Hull stood fast. So it was yet another embarrassing retreat from Hull. Um, so yeah, again, I think the key with Hull is Parliament got that. Parliament seized Hull first, and they similar to the militia ordinance, they did that by appointing the governor without royal consent.
Yeah.
And that,
Yeah.
so for Charles, that was, he saw that siege was, it had legitimacy because he was going there to try and take back his town,
Yeah.
which had refused him entry.
Which goes, doesn't it? That there's clearly a series of events that are in motion which lead to the kind of this to the beginning, as you said. Like there's events that are taking place which are only escalating and leading to this moment where Parliament says, okay, this is it. We've had enough. We're going to raise arms. Raising, I mean, the fact that they're raising an army, I mean, that should be, I know, alarm bells should be ringing everywhere.
Yeah,
And of course, it leads, doesn't it, to the fact that that kind of the outbreak. I think
yeah,
so. You get a sequence of events which take place, and I think whole. I mean, in fact, you've got a siege going on already. It's
yeah,
only going to increase tensions, I think, even further. But he said Parliament taking it without any royal assent. Really interesting to think about that both
yeah,
actors here are in play. Parliament and the king are both almost antagonizing each other. It feels like, and so
yeah,
it's just no one's doing anything to de-escalate it. They're just it just is de-escalating one another, which leads to
yeah.
this moment.
That's it, and you've got both sides really that mistrusted the other, and as it escalated, as you say, it got to the point where you just really couldn't back down, because it had got to that point that whoever did back down would not be able to retain their position.
Yeah,
Something would have to change it. Um, yeah, that's the key. Neither side could back down, and I think that the chances of having a working relationship between both parties had passed in 1641, and
hmm
that's when Charles finally did start to negotiate in a really major way. The negotiations and the concessions were coming out quite regularly, um, but for Parliament, they were seeing, okay, there's a lot of concessions there. It could be a basis for a working government, but actually you've got to put your trust in that side that you've just beaten down. You've got to put your trust that that person, or
yeah,
the king and his supporters are gonna stick to that. So yeah, it was really going to be
yeah.
impossible unless one of them rolled over.
Exactly, and because I think there's certainly a lot of arrogance and pride on both sides as well, so that's going to lead to that not happening. The
Yeah,
palm turns were similar in that regards. Got a great question actually, which those who know me know that I like the memory and the after effect of the Civil War and the legacy, and especially I know someone in here is from Colchester, so hello to you. But that's where I did my PhD on. But this question is fantastic because I think it's really interesting, and I wanted to ask this question myself. So thank you for this question. First of all, fabulous analysis of the timeline, which I think is so true. So it was an absolutely brilliant analysis of it. But could any action of his subjects simply be considered a rebellion? Does it only come a civil war because Parliament won the wars? I think that's a great question because, yeah,
yeah,
is it really considered a civil war during the conflict? Is it only after that we see it as a war? So declaration of war as well becomes a bit more. complex because actually no one at that time probably saw it as a civil war. Perhaps I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I think that's the thing. I think the king was anxious, and that was his sort of last card to declare a rebellion and traitors. It was treason, and Parliament were particularly unhappy with that. So as I say, he raises his standard, and he's prevailed upon by the Earl of Southampton and others to send peace envoys to Westminster. And one of the first things those envoys are told by MPs and peers is revoke the proclamations you've made. Stop referring to people as traitors and rebels. They're not. And they also said that when he declared Hotham a traitor at Hull in April, they were saying he isn't a traitor. He is loyal to King and Parliament. And it's that's the difficulty, isn't it? Because Parliament are very careful, in those days not to come out and make it a rebellion because they know it delegitimizes their position. And really, that's how Charles ended up with 1,000 troops when Parliament had 15. Because throughout that slide, Parliament really did have the upper hand, and Charles looked pretty weak, pretty reactionary. And you're not going to put your life and estate on the line for somebody who looks, weak and reactionary. You want to really see how this is going to turn out first, aren't you? So
Yeah, 100%. And I always find it interesting by the battle cries of especially the Parliamentarian Army at the beginning of the war, where they do say they are for the king. I mean, it's very interesting and very confusing as well. When you're trying to analyze it, but they are, because again, there's this complex situation going on in this conflict. It's not as simple as perhaps we think it is. And I was thinking as you're speaking about Clarendon as well. Was why hasn't Clarendon mentioned this? Because for him, this would have, especially as I said, as a lawyer, someone trained in these kind of aspects, for him, it would have been seen as as a rebellion. The Pompeians language was more of a rebellion. They're in terms of they're saying for the king, but against councillors. So it's a protest. It's kind of language they're using is very careful language in that regards against councillors, as protests had done beforehand. You go back to the early modern and even medieval kind of revolts or protests against the monarchy, always very similar. While the calling of war would be, again, you declared war against other nations, didn't you? But with declare war it gets quite complex language. I think this is perhaps why this. I think it's probably why this start date has been so hazy as well, because no one ever really wanted to say it was a war until much later on, and where, or even in a time frame, people didn't want to perhaps admit it as well, because they are wary, as you said as well, of what's going on as well, which I think is important. I hope that makes sense. What I was saying.
It does. And if you think about all of the declarations that are flying about, it would take someone like Thomason, who collected them all. It would take people to actually hang on to them and sort of piece them together and understand that chain of events even then. Again, especially how long they can be. So
yeah, exactly. Does anyone have any more questions? We've got some people saying how great the talk is, which is fantastic. But any other questions people have, please do ask. Otherwise, you just hear me ask questions, and you don't want to just want that, because I do have questions. So I will maybe ask another question, and maybe people can think of that, because we've got about 5 minutes of time. So
I tell you what, I could say about Clarendon. So it has, I think, more and more of late, there's a lot of dispute around Clarendon's works. So people are saying that they were edited, they were then reissued at the turn of the 18th century and throughout. So it has sort of later political spins in there, So it would be interesting to know, what are the amendments in there, and you know, again, he is just one person, but you could see with that cross section of contemporaries there, you have some people saying that it's April, some people are saying that it's August the 10th, others are saying it's July. A lot of people, must have been in the eye of the storm, especially the Midlands, hearing, the King's representatives trying to read out the commissions of array to seize munitions and supplies, and then Parliament's representatives come along and reading out the militia ordinance to try and do the same. And that's what caused a lot of the street fights and the military clashes. Armed local armed forces going around the county. So I suppose for people living in that, really, you would see that as war. In actuality, it's there. It's around you.
Well, I think you mentioned some good point there. We've got 2 questions to come in, but I'll make a good read into the point as well. Is that you mentioned the idea that in the Midlands and the things going on, maybe as well something to consider that the start of the war depended also where you came from as well in England. If you were in, say, example, in the east, Norwich, Ipswich, kind of Colchester area, the war has a very limited kind of aspect to your daily life for the beginning of the war generally, apart from a few events which we're going to. But then in other parts of the country, it's much more, like, say, Hull, for example, they're at the centre of the start of this conflict, really. But then, like, if you go to, like, where I grew up in Kent, isn't much going on really in terms of what's going on. But in the north, in the Midlands, and the West Country, there is. So maybe as well something about locality as well, and people's own perceptions when they started depended on what they saw and they felt and they perceived. But that's just the last question. That's because I'm a local historian, so I will always bring up the locality.
I think what you could say is that contemporaries were probably just as divided as us on when we see the start of it.
100%.
I think really.
It does feel that from the people you mentioned as well, that there's certainly a lot of different viewpoints on when it started. We've got more questions here. Oh, we've got 3 more questions actually. So, great. I put out 4 questions and we get 3 at once. One question, which I think is something that we both can actually answer, is the legacy and evolving historiography about the civil wars. I think which is the first question. I mean, the second one, did Charles have to die? Is a very big question. But the first question we can certainly, I think, just talk about briefly. A little bit about the legacy and evolving historiography about the Civil War. So is there anything you want to talk about in that regards and the changes perhaps we're seeing in our contemporary historical landscape?
I mean, there's so much, isn't there? That's the thing. There's so much you can see about the legacy, and what didn't happen that might have happened had the civil wars ended differently. What did it prevent? The bloodletting. Would it have happened? Is it inevitable? Would it have happened in the 1660s, 70s, 80s? It is a very interesting point, and that there's lots of relevant. It's something, and that's the surprising thing, that something with the magnitude of the civil wars and everything that's involved, it's continued through the centuries, but it's very much, it's not really explored in great or as much detail as it could be.
That's very true, and the civil wars haven't been part of the mainstream in England for a long time because of, well, actually we don't know why. Actually, the reasons why that is the case, it's quite sad. Just some things to know about historiography, just based off what I know. I mean, we're certainly moving into like legacy memory of Civil War as quite of a key theme that's going on in historiography right now. So a lot of works on that, including my own. just putting that one out there. But generally as well, there's a lot of that's taking place. I mean, what I like about this as well is this is really a fresh approach. Just today's talk on the start. I mean, historians have written about the causes of the Civil War like endlessly. There's a lot of books about the causes, but this actually takes us really like razor thin to actually when did it actually begin, and that is something that hasn't really been covered really in history. So this is why I like it so much, because it gives us a fresh approach to it, which we need more of. Actually, we need more fresh approaches to the Civil War, which I think is important. The thing with a lot of histories of the Civil War, especially in history, is that they often tend to be very political, because it's a very political conflict. So you always have to read a few historians to kind of get a right gist of what's taking place, I find.
Yeah.
And second question about, did child have to die?
Yeah,
Depends
well,
on who you ask.
yeah, that's true. I mean, I think I think that there's a lot of comments and sort of suggest, people think that if only he'd negotiated, that's something you hear a lot, and that's something that I looked at in the biography. If only he'd negotiated, he might have saved his life. Well, I think the point for me is that in 1646, when the First Civil War ended, the English Civil War, and the king was defeated, and then he was in captivity, it got to the point where he had given away and granted away a lot of concessions up to that point, and we tend to forget what he gave away in 1641 prior to the war. So he's entering the war having granted away a lot of concessions. So really, what is there left to give? And once you get to those big points, which are the church and the military, that's where kind of enough becomes enough for Charles. And I personally, I don't think you can avoid enough his religious beliefs, because at the end of that civil war, when he's defeated, he believes that God is punishing him, and he's believing, just like Cromwell and all other leaders at that time, a lot of emphasis is put on God, and Charles, for his part, believes that he's granted too many concessions. He's allowed his opponents to make too many amendments to the church and to the state, and that's why God's punishing him. So there's a particular period in his captivity where he stands absolutely firm, and it's a result of that. But I think his wife, even, and a lot of people today, it's easy to look at that and say he's been stubborn. He didn't have to die, but it's just so much. It's really quite complex.
It is as well, and I think just my own 2 pence off the thought there as well. Just for those who are here from Colchester, just the siege of 1648. I mean, the wars have dragged on so long now that something's going to happen. Whether it was right or not is a whole different question, but something was going to happen because of how the wars were escalating throughout the period. We've got more questions. And this is just a fun question to answer. This is
Well,
what happens? Go on, Mark. What happened if a stray cannibal had killed Charles at Edgehill? What do you think?
well, this is a good question, because at Edgehill, it was the parliamentarian artillery that opened up, and they were firing at the king. So this is the whole the strange situation you've got with an army drawn up with the king on the opposing side, and they're unleashing the artillery against the king, who's riding through his ranks. They're firing at him now. Yeah, what if a stray cannonball killed him? I mean, that's regicide straight off, isn't it? So you.
It would. I would love. I'd not love to see, but it'd be so interesting. Yeah, because what would happen? I mean, so the king's dead, so Charles II would be down with king, but what's Parliament's relationship with him? Because it's really about the relationship between individual monarch to the Parliament, really. I mean, because we know James I had problems with Parliament, but he managed to keep them generally under line. But yeah, interesting, isn't it?
I think then you'd probably have the fight or the battle probably for the regency, wouldn't you? Because I think
Maybe,
Charles,
yeah,
he's only 12.
So Henrietta
13 at that point,
would be the regent,
12, so.
and that would have caused issues because of the religious aspect of Henrietta. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, I think that's when Parliament would probably say, well, we want a hand in choosing who the regent should be. That, you know, the Prince of Wales needs to be raised right, and, you know, and that's when you get the battle over how is that that new king going to be brought up and schooled. Really, you know, can you
Yeah,
actually achieve a balance of government through educating the new king, the young new king, in a way that is more moderate?
yeah.
Who knows?
We got some just very sort of very quick comments which we can fly through because just because I like to give everyone a chance to just have their time. This question by James I think is interesting. Not a question but comment. Because I actually taught on the exact same thing. When did the Second World War start? And actually, like the Civil War, it's a bit more complex of when it started because it depends on who you asked. And this is the same thing here. I think it's nice to know actually the Civil War perhaps isn't alone in actually having a difficulty trying to find out when it started. But what I do like again is about today is that, you know, Mark, is that you've given us actually something to think about here. Actually, go actually, it isn't perhaps what you perhaps what you think it is, and they go, you got a point. You've got a really good point. So, uh, because actually, really, for the Second World War, you're probably thinking probably earlier in the 30s with, you know, invasion of China by Japan. These things are taking place. That could be the start of the Second World War. People don't talk about that because it doesn't
Yeah,
affect, you know, these things. You know, it's a bigger thing going on. So, uh, other comments about the memory of Civil War is shadow certainly loomed over events of 1688 and all through the
yeah,
18th century. I think
definitely.
so
Yeah,
true. And as also commented, also later on as well. Yeah, so it really does.
yeah, it carried on
uh,
right through, doesn't it?
yeah.
And you know, it's molded, isn't it, and suited, you know, to whoever maybe needs it or whoever's got the
Yeah.
power at that time.
Yeah.
How do they want it to be remembered? And
100%. Actually, that's a really good point. It is molded, and there's a concept that I've termed, not termed, it's before me, but I've kind of owned it now. But it's, you know, it becomes usable
yeah,
because it can be molded, it can be shaped, it can be morphed into whatever suits that contemporary audience. It's why Civil War is so interesting because it can be used in different contexts, and
mm,
people throughout time have done that, haven't they?
yeah,
Uh, we've got something from Stephen here, which talks about obviously the memory of the Civil War has continued, obviously in Irish folk memory, which we both know as well. Um, which again, it's again for Ireland. When does the Civil War start? For them, well,
yeah,
for them, it's for the kingdoms. It's a much bigger thing. But when does it start? These questions are things to consider, aren't they?
definitely.
Um, but nonetheless, we should probably start to bring this to a close. There's so many good questions there. I've just got to say thank you to everyone who
Was
asked
there one
questions
more
because
there as well? Is it Jenny?
there's Jenny. We got just linking to your point earlier, which is
Yeah,
yeah, which agreeing to be your point, which I thought was a good point to make as well. So absolutely brilliant. But just want to say thank you to everyone and their comments and questions because they've been
yeah,
absolutely fantastic, uh, really thought provoking and really powerful, and I've enjoyed asking them. And even I've got another, like, you know, delving in there with some answers as well from me just because I get so excited for about this period. But uh, thank you for the questions. But more importantly, though, thank you, Mark, for this talk because
oh no, no, thank you.
it's been
Yeah,
fantastic. It's been eye opening. I think everyone can agree it's been eye opening. It's been a pleasure. It's been interesting as well, and it's what's so great about this talk has been it's been a fresh approach to something that we
yeah,
perhaps all think we know, and then we go, but we don't know, and that that's a sign of a really good talk. So thank you so much for this.
no, great, thanks,
Um,
thanks everybody.
and this is of course our last talk before Christmas, so there's no more history doors for a little while. Do subscribe and like before then, so you can keep updated with what we're going on. We have more talks coming back in the new year, and we got to get some more Civil War talks in because it's just the best period, isn't it? Really.
Yeah,
So I'll have to we have to do that at some point. Um, so that being said, thank you so much, everyone. People just saying they've really loved it.
Oh, that's great.
Thank you everyone for your comments as well, and we will say bye for this evening. So bye from myself.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Cool, and we'll see you soon.